welcome to the third edition of Buccacino's China Night. I don't like to brag, but as Ray says, this is really a stellar panel. Two of the best journalists on the planet about China, and they're both Australian. Richard McGregor on my far left went to China in the late 90s, where he opened the first bureau for The Australian, and where, by the way, he hosted Rupert Murdoch, and he will tell you more about that later. He then went back to China in 2000 and worked for the Financial Times and was bureau chief along the way there too. He's written 3 excellent books on China. The first is called The Party. So I asked him today, how did you manage to do the reporting on the party? Because this is the most sensitive issue for the Chinese. And what's extraordinary is he basically told them the truth. He said, I'm writing about how the country is governed. And that's what the book says. It's governed by the most powerful political party with the most powerful boss in the world. And it's a great read. He's also written a book about Xi Jinping called Xi Jinping, The Backlash, and he's written a book called Asia's Reckoning. Chris and I were colleagues in the New York Times Bureau for quite a few years, and this sort of feels a little like old home week. Chris, as Ray said, spent 24 years in China, studied at Renmin University, one of the best universities in Beijing, has a PhD on Chinese history, politics?
Chinese studies, I think we'll say.
Chinese studies, that leaves a lot of room for whatever it is. Worked for Reuters, and then finally the New York Times was able to snare him in 2012. Chris knows so much about China and its intricacies that he's not always been the most favorite person of the authorities, and I can't enumerate the number of times that he's been expelled, but he's had to wait out a time in Hong Kong to get a visa, right? And then when he was in Wuhan at the outbreak of the virus, he was the only Western reporter there. He was there for 78 days, and then in the midst of it, his visa ran out, and they refused to renew it. Came back to Beijing, and he had to leave, and he went to Hong Kong, hoping that they would renew it from Hong Kong. No renewal, so he was basically expelled, and he's been reporting from China, on China, from Sydney. I'm not sure of the exact number of Western reporters who've been expelled from China in the last 2 years, but it's about 20? Something like that?
It must be something like that, yes.
20,
yeah.
8 of them from the New York Times. So Chris's journey is in a way a little portrait of how Beijing is looking at Western journalists. We're going to divide this into 3 sections. We're going to have a kind of discussion about the issues of the day, or at least I'm going to ask pointed questions of my 2 colleagues, and they're going to give brilliant answers. And then we're going to do a little section on what I call war stories, which is basically what it's been like to report in China. And then we're going to have a section on just very fast questions, and Richard and Chris will answer with 1 sentence. And we'll do all that in 45 to 50 minutes. So here goes. Richard, Taiwan. Is war with Taiwan a serious proposition? That is, war between the United States and China over Taiwan. And from China's perspective, what's the timetable?
Okay, so in a word, the answer is yes. Now, by the way, Jane has told us that we've got to be very succinct tonight. But I'm just going to be very quick and just a background on Taiwan in case people don't know. You know, Taiwan was basically sort of part of China. Then it became a Japanese colony in 1895 when the Japanese wanted to be imperialists as well. It went back to China in 1945 at the end of the war. And then in 1949 when Chiang Kai-shek lost the war against Mao Zedong and the communists, he fled to China and set up a government in Taiwan. And until about the mid-90s, both the government in Taiwan and the government in Beijing said, we're the true government of all of China. But that's when Taiwan became democratic, and that basically changed everything. Most people in Taiwan, it's built steadily since over that time, don't want to be governed by China. About 90%, according to the most credible polling, and even the 10% who do want to be part of single China, half of them don't want to be governed by the Communist Party. So there's absolutely no chance of a sort of a happy, willing reunification or unification, whatever you talk, however you talk about it. So how does one manage that? Now, within China itself, within Chinese politics, it's absolutely baked into the cake within the Communist Party that they will take Taiwan sooner or later. For many years, that was merely an aspiration. They did not have the military power, the economic power, the diplomatic power, the confidence to do it. Now they are on the verge of having that. Overwhelming military strength, greater confidence and the like. But having said that, it's extremely risky to invade another country. It's extremely risky to invade an island. It's especially difficult if Taiwan is also backed by the United States. Now, there's a whole bunch of literature about how long it takes, 1 day, 30 days. Can the US get there in time? Can Taiwan defend itself? And all of that. But there's no doubt if there were a war, I think China would eventually win. It might be a Pyrrhic victory. But I also think it's important, don't just think about war, because there's a number of ways that China can do it. China doesn't want to fight a war, by the way. They'd prefer to win by other means. They can have a blockade of Taiwan. They can have a partial blockade of Taiwan. They can increase the psychological pressure to the point where Taiwan has to negotiate. Or they can, they can grab, Taiwan has a number of outlying islands, some 8 kilometers or so from China itself, and they can grab them and gradually encroach on Taiwan's space. But having said that, to show why it's really serious, imagine if Taiwan wins. Now, Taiwan's an island of about 25, 26 million people. Look at Hong Kong. China would have to do to Taiwan what they're doing to Hong Kong, unravel an entire society, crush civil society, crush the military, change the police, basically upend every government on the island itself. And so you might have a sort of a massive Northern Ireland on a gargantuan scale in a struggle against an invading force. So it's incredibly risky on every count you look at it, and especially so because Beijing, when I was in the 90s, Chris would remember this, China had a kind of charm strategy. We'll charm them, they'll come over. That's all gone. China isn't trying the charm anymore. It's trying force through a variety of means. And sooner or later, not this year, as we'll come back to, is all about the Party Congress and Xi Jinping getting another term. But the head of Pacific PACCOM, the Pacific Indo-PACCOM, I should say, the new name, in Hawaii, talked about 2025, 26. That seems like a good timetable. So it's definitely something that could happen in the next decade.
So, Chris, what do you think is in Xi Jinping's head about Taiwan? He talks about the China dream. He talks about the rejuvenation of China. Taiwan is the crown jewel that completes that dream. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I think also Richard made a very important starting point for understanding this issue, which is that the idea that Taiwan is an irrevocable part of a unified China is really baked into a lot of Chinese people's attitudes and beliefs. And that's partly a product of decades of official education and propaganda by the government, but it goes beyond that as well. And I'm sure Jane and Richard also know people, friends in Beijing, Chinese friends elsewhere, who can be very critical of the government in many ways, but feel very deeply when it comes to these issues of Chinese national unity in Taiwan. So that's a long way of coming to the point that, yes, the Taiwanese issue is partly a product of Communist Party propaganda, but it goes beyond that. And when it comes to trying to understand where Taiwan fits in Xi Jinping's vision, I think that that's an important starting point. When he's articulated this idea of a China dream of a unified, strong, prosperous, confident China by the middle of this century, a part of that is appealing to Chinese people's idea that this decades of humiliation in which Taiwan has not been a part of us, that's going to be solved somehow. Now, that said, that doesn't mean that he's necessarily thirsting for war, but I do think the shift of military power across the Taiwan Strait has been an important factor, which is one reason why we're becoming increasingly worried about the risks of conflict there. If there was one thing holding back the Chinese leadership from making a compelling case for taking back Taiwan, it was the fact that their military was nowhere near as strong as the United States, the main security guarantor of Taiwan. Now, that's begun to change over the past decade. And there'll be debates among experts about where exactly power now lies. But when it comes to the balance of forces off the Chinese coast around Taiwan, I think there's a growing body of thought that thinks that if China, if it doesn't already have the military wherewithal for taking Taiwan, it's getting closer. And the implication of that is it goes beyond the military calculus. That shifts the politics as well. Because for decades, the one compelling answer that the Chinese government had about why it couldn't move on Taiwan is because we don't have the strength. Now, when you take away that compelling rationale for not acting, that doesn't necessarily mean the government is reaching for war or thirsting for war. But when it comes to making the calculations about Taiwan, it means that military option is always much more present. And particularly so now when there's a great deal of friction between China and the United States. Just one final point is one reason why Taiwan's become much of a worry. It's shifted much more to the center of contention between Washington and Beijing as well. Through this sort of ratcheting process, both sides now see Taiwan as an arena where their broader authority and strength is being contested. And so that means when it comes to even small acts or gestures over Taiwan, both sides can have an oversized reaction. And so that means in coming years, there's not just the risk of a calculated conflict over Taiwan, but also the risk of ratcheting calculations leading to conflict as well.
And we both one of us should have said, if Taiwan goes, then America's position in Asia is damaged, probably irreparably damaged, probably lost, right? Because Taiwan is next to Japan, Japan's compromised, so that's really the end.
So that brings up the question, do you think, each of you, do you think the Biden administration, for example, would go for war, or do you think they would, if something happened and they had to do it, I mean, not they had to do it, but they were confronted with a choice in the next 2 years, would they do it? Would they go to war? Over Taiwan, what does it mean for the United States?
I think, well, that's a harder question to answer, actually, about domestic public opinion in the US. I mean, the national security state might be behind defending Taiwan. Are the American people behind that? Do they see it as a vital national interest? I think Trump certainly wouldn't have. Biden would think differently, but can he carry the country with him? I'm not so sure about that.
Chris?
I'd offer a slightly different way into answering that question, which is, I think in Beijing, viewed from Beijing, particularly in the past few years, particularly since COVID, there's been a coalescence of views in China that American power is in serious trouble, if not long-term decline. And so when it comes to calculations about the future, that matters in Beijing. And in a sense, it matters regardless of what intentions are in the White House. So I think one other factor that comes into play now is this increasingly prevalent view in China that American power is, at least relatively speaking, waning. And that sooner or later, the Asia-Pacific is going to be increasingly dominated by Chinese influence, and therefore Taiwan and the solution to it is going to be increasingly in China's grasp as well.
In other words, they feel the United States doesn't have the stomach for it.
And you see that spelled out now. I remember, I think it was throughout military exercises last year, one way in which the Chinese government threatens Taiwan is through these military exercises, which have become larger and more realistic. And the spokespeople for the Chinese military are quite explicit. We're showing that we can do this, and Americans can say that they might intervene, but we don't believe them. They don't have the fight, they don't have the passion. This is our interest, it's not theirs.
And they've shown this by, what, doubling the number of jet fighters over Taiwan in 2021 compared to 2020?
Yeah, these are these intrusions into the air defense identification zone, which is not what you would call Taiwan's self-described sovereign airspace, but it's the area where aircraft are supposed to declare themselves. And China is usually held back from going into that space, but they do it more and more. I mean military aircraft, as a way of reminding Taiwan that we're here and we're not going to leave, and when we want to, we can get closer and closer.
Richard, the Australian government has signed up for AUKUS. What does this scenario that you and Chris mean for Australia?
Well, I guess one of the purposes of AUKUS is to extend the reach of the Australian military, in this case submarines, and make us a more potent player if there is any kind of conflict, much further away from our shores. The Collins-class submarines, their range is much shorter than nuclear submarines, right? So AUKUS...
But why would Australia want to sign up to something which both of you say is going to end, their ally, the United States, is going to end up on the losing side?
Well, no, I don't know whether they are or not, but I'm saying what is the aim of AUKUS? AUKUS is a strategic transformation in Australia. About 2 years ago, Mr. Morrison made a speech about how the current period reminded him of the 1930s, with all that entails. I think until AUKUS, his response to that didn't match that rhetoric at all. It turned out he'd been working on something altogether different. So AUKUS is not just submarines, it's about a greater degree of technological and technical cooperation with the US. It's also, I think we're going to see some announcements soon about this, about giving Australia a sort of a ballistic missile capability manufactured in Australia. It's a whole bunch of things, not just submarines, but the big, the nuclear-powered submarines, so the theory goes, are a much more potent weapon than the French attack class ones would have been, and they have a much greater range, stay underwater for longer, etc., etc. That's the plan. The problem with AUKUS, of course, and particularly in submarines, is the lead time. If they were to be built in Australia and everything went well, in theory we get the first one about 2040, 2038, and by then it could be basically all over. And in theory the Collins class are going to be retrofitted, updated until then, but it's way off into the future. And even if there's many options I think people are looking at. There's the Adelaide option, which would obviously take the longest. There's building some in the United States, bringing them out here and the like. I think one of the big challenges for Australia is AUKUS might be a great idea in theory, but can we execute it as a country?
Well, it's not only whether Australia can execute it, it's also whether the United States will actually share the crown jewel of nuclear technology in the nuclear reactor. Chris, you've been describing AUKUS to New York Times readers, and you have pointed out the paucity of nuclear expertise in Australia. What's your take? Will the US Navy actually come to the party when push comes to shove?
Yeah, I should say in reporting on AUKUS and the submarine proposal, one thing that did strike me is that when you talk to these wizened naval veterans and submarine veterans in Australia, the United States and Britain, even supporters of this proposal will often hesitate and say, but it's really hard. Building conventional submarines is hard enough, and our audience doesn't need reminding of how many times Australia's buggered that up.
Great record.
Nuclear-powered submarines are an entirely different realm of complexity and difficulty. And so this is going to be an enormous effort. It is striking since the announcement in September. There hasn't been that much public conversation from the government about what this entails. But Australia, by my understanding, produces a few graduates from its one program in nuclear engineering every year, and it's going to require hundreds, if not thousands, to sustain a program like that. So that means that we're going to be very reliant on Britain and perhaps more importantly the United States to make this project work. And that's going to have to work through at least several electoral cycles in each country. And we've seen what American politics has been like over the past few years. American military procurement and planning is immensely complicated. It involves a great deal of congressional politics as well. So that's going to be another whole realm of complications. The Australian government has sometimes spoken as if Australia has these off-the-rack models of submarines it could order from Britain or the United States, the Astute class, or what's the American one? The Virginia class. The fact is that by the time that Australia starts building these, they're either going to be obsolescent or out of date, and the United States and Britain are going to be working on a new generation of nuclear submarines. Do we sign up to that new generation and all of the delays, potential delays that implies? Do we use an older generation? There's all sorts of complications here.
So what's the bottom line here, each of you? Is AUKUS good for the US or is it good for Australia, or neither?
Well, if you believe the government about the threat from China, the need to defend ourselves and or be part of a bigger coalition against China, then AUKUS, in theory, is a good thing. But I think we've denuded our industrial capacity. To execute AUKUS, we have to have almost a wartime level of focus to do something as complicated as this and as rapidly as this to make it worthwhile, plus the cost. The attack class, I think, was $68 billion over time. The period of the contract, the nuclear-powered subs, if they're built in the States, it's about $70 billion. If we build them in Adelaide, it's $80–90 billion. So that's also a massive drain on the budget. And this is over a period, as Chris says, through successive electoral cycles in both countries. It's not just about winning Boothby at the next election. It's a really, really big deal over a long, long time.
But the American shipyards are already booked up for years ahead. Why would they want to be building submarines for Australia when they've got their own submarines to build?
Some of them say they can fit some more in. We'll see about that.
All right, I think we'll move to Xi Jinping, who is, we all know, is the leader of China. Chris, how secure is he in his position?
All of us reporting on the outside about Chinese politics have to be very humble, and there's always room for surprises, but I tend to think he's extremely stable at the moment. I tend to think that the general drift of evidence suggests that he is very dominant, if not omnipotent in Chinese politics. This year, probably in November, we're going to have the 20th Communist Party Congress in Beijing. I think the signs are that Xi Jinping is going to desire and secure another five-year term as Communist Party leader. As always in the run-up to these congresses, there's a run of rumors about opposition, surprises, factional conflict, but I do tend to think that the general pattern of evidence suggests that Xi Jinping is very secure at the moment, despite all of the problems in China. And I think one thing that it's very helpful to remind us of is that what happened in 2020, with the outbreak of COVID, the Chinese government, the Chinese leadership did face a great deal of pressure, did face a wave of anger within China about the initial mishandling of the outbreak of COVID. Nonetheless, once COVID began to spread to other countries, once China began to suppress infections within the country, public sentiment began to shift as well. And if people say that Xi Jinping is weak, I sometimes ask myself, well, 2020 and the COVID crisis was in many ways the greatest crisis in Chinese politics since 1989 and the Tiananmen crisis. Xi Jinping survived that. So when it comes to lesser threats, I think we have to keep them in perspective.
Richard, one of the extraordinary things about your book, Xi Jinping, The Backlash, is I think there's a number in there when you add there are a couple of numbers in there about the people that he dismissed, disciplined, put in jail, in various ways demoted. And I think the total, if you add them up, is about 5 million people. I mean, in a smaller country, that would be a large number. Even in China, that sounds like a lot of people who've got extended families. Isn't there a lot of resentment among certain classes against Xi Jinping?
Yeah, I might say that mini book was written before COVID and before the Hong Kong protests, so a lot has changed since then. So I mean, I think Chris is right that he's a powerful leader, not under any threat. But even when you have powerful leaders, it's important to acknowledge the legion of enemies they have, because that can come back when they're less powerful. So if you look at, you don't really, I mean, you look at the 5 million people are taken down by Xi Jinping by the anti-corruption campaign. Now, the thing to understand about the Communist Party is it's a very leader-friendly system. If the leader is really in charge, that person has enormous executive power. And anti-corruption campaigns in China aren't done by the police force. The party investigates its own, captures its own, arrests its own, and the legal system is an afterthought when they get sentenced. So don't think about the 5 million, think about the elite, the ones who go at the top of the party system, and there was about 100 generals arrested, and I think about 400 or 500 other people from the nomenclatura, the top people. Every one of those people is surrounded by a whole coterie of people who are their acolytes in the system, who rely on their patronage in the system to be elevated, their families who invest their money, who've gotten rich off them. So they're all once really powerful, untouchable people, and overnight they're gone. And that's it, they're out. And a lot of them have lost their money as well, and their privileges. So that sort of resentment doesn't sort of go overnight. Now, the liberal intelligentsia in China hates Xi Jinping as well. That's maybe dissipated a bit, I think, because being locked in a fight with the US, that's a kind of existential struggle. People can rally around the party like we rally around the flag in our countries. But he's a lot of enemies, but they're ineffective enemies at the moment. Nobody can organise against Xi. Nobody can set up groups to discuss issues which are critical of him. So he's untouchable at the moment, but nothing lasts forever. I don't know how long that position is sustained for. I think for some years, actually. But it will uncover over time, I think, other fragilities in the system.
And you don't think top business people who have been taken down or have chosen to leave, I was going to say forced, but have chosen to leave because they fear for their lives if they live in China, they can't collect together and organize?
There's two sets of top business people who've been disabled by him. First of all, it was the heads of a lot of big state-owned companies. Some of them Fortune 500 companies, PetroChina and the like. They were the first target of the anti-corruption campaign. That faction in China has got a wonderful name. They're known as the Petroleum Gang. They all got outed. I think the thing you're referring to more recently is the crackdown on the tech sector in China, private business people and the like, and they have absolutely no ability to push back against the party state once it decides to go for them. It might hurt their economy over the longer term, that's another question, but they're not powerful people once they cross the line.
I might just add a point on that too, Jane, which is the Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping in part rules through fear. And these anti-corruption investigations have certainly sent a shiver of fear into a lot of people. And they've reminded people that ultimately, if the Communist Party leadership turns on you, your life can change overnight, and you can see that. But I think it's also important to remember, and I'm sure Richard doesn't disagree with this, that the Chinese Communist Party is also trying to offer its population something more active and positive as well. And people might not necessarily agree with the entire package before them, but there's elements of that can be attractive to people in China. And while we can dismiss Communist Party beliefs as mere propaganda, this vision that Xi Jinping repeats again and again of a strong, prosperous, confident, safe China is one that does have purchase with people. And the Communist Party has seized on the experience of COVID to reinforce that message. Look at the mess that the United States and Europe made of this. We kept you safe. Now, implicitly in that, we screw it up early. We don't talk about that, but we kept you safe. And I think that message of safety and security does have purchase with a lot of people. Not necessarily so much with the business elites who have lost out, but with a lot of ordinary Chinese people, that message does resonate.
I think on that point, I think China has learned a lot by looking at America and the impact eventually on US politics through the election of Mr. Trump about inequality. I mean, it's more complicated, but that's a big part of it. And, you know, the Chinese slogan of common prosperity is really, you know, a good dose of, in some respects, old-fashioned socialism or income equalisation. In theory, we'll see if they can actually pull that off. But I think they looked at what happened in the States and the sort of crack up there between the haves and the have-nots. And as Chris said, amongst ordinary Chinese people, the fact that the big shots are getting their comeuppance, well, that's great. You know, that's not unpopular.
I mean, isn't the bottom line is that this growing middle class of how many is it? What?
Depending how you judge it.
500 million people. I mean, they're all so much better off than they were even 20 years ago in their own living memory. So we were talking a little bit about COVID right there. So let's turn to COVID right now and a little bit of Chris's experience in Wuhan. He was there, as I mentioned in the beginning, for 78 days during the initial breakout in Wuhan in 2020. So I think
he's since tested negative, by the way,
over multiple occasions. So people are very curious. Was it a lab leak or was it a wild animal market leak? What's the origin?
I should preface my answer by explaining that I did go to Wuhan thinking this is going to be a really serious story and it could last 2 weeks. And,
I heard from colleagues he had a couple of T-shirts and one pair of jeans. I won't go into further details.
So
he's here to tell the story.
So when it comes to pronouncing on these questions, I don't feel I've got too much expertise. This whole question about the origins of the virus is, I fear it's never going to go away now. The whole WHO investigation into the origins has been mishandled from multiple sides. Tracing the origins of new coronaviruses is scientifically a very challenging thing to begin with. Trying to understand how they jump from animals to humans is going to be difficult even in the easier circumstances, and we're certainly not in the easier circumstances now that the issue has become polarized between, you know, a group of people who are strongly convinced that it leaked from a lab in Wuhan and a body of people who strongly believe that it was natural spillover, probably from a marketplace in Wuhan. And then the Chinese government that just doesn't want to deal with it and has been inventing conspiracy theories that it came from an American military lab. Now, in those circumstances, it becomes very difficult to get to the truth. I do hope our scientists, including a good number of Australian scientists, can continue their work on this, and collaboration between Chinese scientists and foreign scientists would be really helpful to get to the answers there. If you put a proverbial gun to my head and ask me where I tend to lean, well, I'm a journalist. Let the evidence lead where it does. I do tend to think that the weight of evidence is still toward natural spillover now. And that can be very hard to explain when you have one of China's premier virus labs in Wuhan where this broke out. I understand that, but when it comes to looking at the particulars of how this spread, I do tend to think that I'm open to different arguments, but I do tend to think that there's still a very strong case for natural spillover.
And if I could just ask you quickly, you were in Wuhan when the Chinese public health officials were warning the government that this is really serious, and the government, for a bunch of reasons, didn't want to act and didn't act. What's happened to those public health officials who spoke out then, and how are Chinese public health officials acting towards the virus today?
Right, so what we're talking about here is going way back into the late months of 2019, when this mysterious pneumonia-like illness began cropping up in hospitals in Wuhan. And there were a number of doctors in those hospitals, and also a number of lower-level health officials who were very concerned. And they sent away samples from patients' lungs to private labs. They realized very quickly that this was a coronavirus, which doesn't arise very often. And so they began raising the alarm, not necessarily publicly, but with their colleagues, with officials, and some of them tried to warn the government as well. At that point, going into early 2020 now, a lot of them faced a great deal of pressure, intimidation, even punishment to stay silent about this. The government wanted to deal with the problem, but it's in its own way. And in a sense, it didn't want to be told about all of this information. Finding out what's happened to them since has been very difficult because
they've been silenced.
They've been silenced. They won't take phone calls. The ones who have spoken to us, like a lot of doctors, they saw a lot of terrible things going through COVID.
So they're really shaken.
So they're really shaken, not just by that, but what happened in the hospitals afterwards, this wave of patients coming in. And as we've seen in the rest of the world, not enough medical equipment, not enough protective equipment. A lot of that's shaken them as well. I know that some of them have left the system. Some of them remain in the system, but bruised and shaken. But a lot of them are very proud about what they did and said then. I think that's important. Those medical professionals in China, in a sense, played a really instrumental role in telling the world about what was happening.
They were the ones who alerted us.
It took a while in the end, but that's how it came out, yes.
Richard, just quickly, what's your sense of how normal life is in China today? It's very hard for outsiders to know because it's such a rigmarole to get in. But from what you've been able to report, how normal is it?
Well, it depends. It's normal within your bubble. In other words, if you live in Beijing, you can stay in Beijing and lead a normal life until you go out of Beijing, and then every other place you go into, you've got to sort of, I think, use your mobile phone to check in, and you've got to have a green light before you can go in anywhere, and the like. But the problem is, though, the moment they find just a handful of cases, the city will be locked down and you can't move. The latest one in Xi'an, which is about 10 million people, I think they only had 16 cases, was it, initially, and the whole city was locked down.
16 cases among 10 million people, and they locked down the city?
Yes. And in Shenzhen the other day, next to Hong Kong, they had 2 cases, and they started a lockdown there. So this is still Melbourne on steroids, probably the other way around. So this is still their approach. So it's normal until it's not. It's not normal for travel, but you can basically lead a normal life. You know, China is still pursuing COVID zero. And from their point of view, I'll just say this quite quickly, I think it's, in some respects, quite rational because, you know, we talk a lot these days about state capacity in Australia as well with COVID and the like, in an era of great power competition. So China can go to Xi'an, for example, and say, test 10 million people in 2 days, and they can get it done. What they don't have in terms of state capacity is a good public health system. So if the virus did spread rapidly, you would start to see the sorts of scenes you saw in Wuhan in the early days of absolute chaos. You've got a lot of old people, frankly, with what are politely called comorbidities. In other words, people have been smoking their entire lives. So there would be total chaos. And plus the Chinese vaccinations, they only use Chinese vaccinations, Chinese-made vaccinations, are pretty average. And they're developing their mRNA vaccination now. So they cannot manage politically, particularly in a year like this, the spread of the virus. So the lockdowns is the path they're going down.
I want to switch now to the Chinese economy, which affects Australia a lot, the world, of course. Chris, is the economy in so much, it's not in its glory days. Do you think that the Chinese economy will catch up with the United States and overtake it? Or do you think that Xi Jinping's meddling in the economy, taking down private enterprises, emphasizing state-run industries, is that having enough of an impact that it will slow down China to the point where maybe it won't overtake the American economy?
Oh, goodness, Jana,
I know you're going to say to me, I'm not an economist.
I always recuse myself from comments on the Chinese economy, and we're in the northern beaches where I understand some people have money and understand about money, so I'm not going to risk making too much of a fool myself. I should say that all of us who have spent time around China have seen the warnings of the impending demise of the Chinese economy come and go over the years. That's not to say that the Chinese government is not approaching important transition points that will make a difference, but I do think it's important to understand that in a country of 1.4 billion people who are still growing, who are still urbanizing, who are still spending, that changes are going to happen over time, and even if they're bad changes, they're going to happen over time as well. I do think that the Chinese government under Xi Jinping it's tried to shift the center of gravity on the economy away from, I wouldn't say free markets, but commerce and free-flowing commerce more to state control. I do think that sometimes commentators outside of China can overstate the extent to which that's transforming the economy quickly. We did mention just then the idea of common prosperity. And Xi Jinping has announced this idea that over the next 10 to 15 years, China's economic strategy is going to shift more and more to building up a larger middle class of middle-income consumers who are going to be more urban, more educated, more prosperous. As part of that, there's a certain egalitarian tilt in policy. But it is notable when Xi Jinping and other officials talk about common prosperity now, they'll lay out this vision and then they'll say, but please remember, this is not Western-style welfarism. This is not Mao-era egalitarianism. We're trying for something different. And without saying whether that's going to succeed or fail, I think it's important to remember that they're trying to deal with all of these demographic changes happening in China anyway. This is a long-term process. So despite the recent attacks on entrepreneurs, I don't, for example, see wholesale renationalization of the Chinese economy or anything like that.
Richard, can the Chinese economy overtake the American one?
Yeah, I reckon it probably will, by about 2028, 2030, but obviously, there's a lot of debate about whether that will happen. I mean, there's no doubt right now that China's having economic problems. In the third quarter of last year, basically the economy stood still. They got no growth at all. That was a combination of the energy crisis, power shortage, COVID lockdowns and the like. They've come back from that since. Don't worry too much if it's 5% growth. People say, oh, that's really low. That's 5% growth now, in aggregate terms, is equal to 10% growth 10 years ago. So 5% is fine. It just depends how China grows. And that's the big problem they're going through now, because they're going, the property sector, which has been great for Australia, iron ore and the like, has been about 20 to 30% of the Chinese economy. The regulators have, in fact, brought on a property crisis. So the headlines you see late last year about this property company, Evergrande, basically going into bankruptcy, that's been a deliberate de-risking. But I think they're worried it's gone too far and getting out of control. And you already see at the moment this year, for absolute certain, you're going to see an easing there in China, because every year there's a party congress on. They unplug the spigots, So Xi Jinping goes into a year of growth.
There are a couple of good war stories that I want Chris and Richard to tell. So Richard, you're first. You had to entertain Rupert Murdoch in Beijing in the late 90s, and he brought along a certain woman. Tell us about it.
Yes, I'm not sure one of my old bosses from this time is. I'm not sure I ever told him this story, but I set up an office for the Australian in 1997 or 8 in Beijing, and I think actually Greg Sheridan had been there in the early 80s for a short period of time. But you know, you've got to hand it to Rupert Murdoch. He was very keen on China at the time. When you would get American executives coming to, like the head of Time, Jerry Levine, when he would come to China, you know, there'd be like an American president.
So what was Rupert like?
Well, just leading up to that, you get an American presidential visit sort of thing, you know, for Jerry Levine, 20 people in the advance party, 40 people with him. And so when Rupert comes, he comes basically by himself with a suitcase and gets off the plane and does it all himself. But on this occasion, when his then head of news in China, Bruce Dover, they organised a dinner and he had his new interpreter, Wendy Deng, there. And we had a small cocktail party beforehand, and I was talking to Wendy, as we had known each other at the time, and I said, and Wendy was saying to me, she was saying, you know, people say horrible things about Rupert all the time. He's a really nice guy. He's a really nice guy. And I said to her, I said, he's not a nice guy. How do you think he got where he got? You know, and then so we have a very interesting dinner, and then a week later people tell me they've been seen holding hands up on the Peak in Hong Kong, and I thought, oh my God, my career is finished.
You still kept your job, that's okay.
But,
so Chris, you and I had a certain experience when we were in the Beijing Bureau of the New York Times together. You wrote an amazing story about how Xi Jinping maneuvered to become the emperor of everything forever, by changing the constitution, a very unusual happening in China. And you detailed how he did this with speed and guile. And guile attracted the attention of the foreign ministry. And I got a call one morning soon afterwards at 8 o'clock in the morning, please be at the foreign ministry at 10 o'clock. So Chris and I go there, and what happens?
So we get called in and we're trying to figure out what to say when they ream me out about this story. And I remember being led into a very big dark room with those very big sofa chairs that they always have for these meetings. And there's 3 or 4 officials who lead us in without saying too much, sit us down. And then one of them, I remember, pulls out his pad of paper and starts reading from it, maligning China's leadership.
Hurting the feelings
of the Chinese people, I believe, came up in it as well. Turning upside down, black and white, and this and that. I don't know whether it came up in that talk, but it certainly came up after the real problem was the word guile in the headline. And I can't tell you how many weeks and months I spent afterward looking up dictionary definitions of guile and the equivalents in Chinese. But I did get a very short visa after that. The other word I'll never use again is zealous. That's the other one I'll never use.
So I'm going to ask you each a question with a one-sentence answer, and then it's over to the audience. So I hope you've got tons of questions. Richard, you have dinner with Xi Jinping. It's à deux. It's just the two of you.
Yes.
And you have each a translator. And it's on neutral territory. It's not in Zhongnanhai, and it's not in Washington. What's the most important question you ask him?
Well, when will he step down and who will succeed him?
Chris, same question.
2 questions, or 2 answers. 2 questions.
2 questions.
When will I get a visa? Yeah. Having thought about this, Jane, the other question I would ask is, tell me what you really think about the United States.
Ah, yes.
We know what he thinks about China, but when it comes to the United States, does he really believe it's in decline? How does he assess its intentions? I think that would be a way of getting him to tell us about China as well.
It's very interesting because, if I may, you know, he's been to Australia, he's been to every state, made a point of coming to every state of Australia.
Tasmania.
No, even Tasmania. I was there when he came to Tasmania, and it was all about, in the press, Australian press, about how he was going to buy apples and, I don't know, do a lot of trade with Tasmania. But what the real purpose was to get a strategic bolt hole in Tasmania so that China's Antarctica boats could dock in Tasmania and get resupplied. Okay, so over to questions.
Hi, my name is Steve Early. Do you think the Belt Road Initiative is almost a global invasion by China?
Actually, I don't. You know, Belt and Road it's a long story, but Belt and Road started out as basically continental Asia, investment in Southeast Asia, continental Asia, linking up to Europe. Since then, it's become a sort of brand name for any Chinese investment anywhere. And you know, you might have an investment in Brazil or Victoria, and they sprinkle a bit of Belt and Road holy water on top and call it Belt and Road. So it's almost a meaningless term now. But I would be really careful about seeing everything as though China taking over, China colonizing these countries. Many African countries, for example, welcome the investment. You know, they're not getting it from other countries. In the Pacific, for example, we underestimate that the agency all these countries have to use their sovereignty so that China can just take over. There's absolutely no doubt there's some cases where countries have taken on too much debt. Sri Lanka is one of them. But if you look at just the headlines on Sri Lanka, you'd think that all they've got is Chinese debt. I think China is the fourth largest debtor after the World Bank and the IMF and the like. China is now caught up in Sri Lankan politics, and I think it's quite problematic for them. So there's no doubt that China is using Belt and Road investments in Cambodia, in parts of the Middle East for geopolitical purposes. They want to use it to get Chinese technical standards in there. Some of it's about surveillance and the like. But I think it's wrong to think about all as China colonizing and taking over, because that's a whole other kind of ball game. And it's different in every country.
There's a few of us here who lived in Hong Kong, loved it. It's obviously changed. Your thoughts on Hong Kong and China, and then finally, Australia seems to be spending a bit of time on Japan as well as China, and just your thoughts on that sort of triangle.
I would describe Australia's policy towards China as basically, you know, in 4 words: internal resilience, external options. In other words, we want to make sure that our democratic institutions are protected and thrive, aren't interfered with in any fashion. And you've seen laws passed in an attempt to affect that. Diplomatically, you know, we have to have other options. We can't simply rely on the United States. Certainly we've doubled down on the United States. But the alliance system within the region is changing. It used to be the centre of the US, used to sit at the centre of a hub and spoke set of alliances, and they would run everything. These days it's very different. It's Japan and India, it's Japan and Australia, it's Australia and Singapore, Australia and Vietnam, Japan and Vietnam. Everybody within the region is looking for other options and friends so that they can manage the rise of China better, and of course also trying to keep the US anchored here, because without the US, I think China just takes over. Very briefly on Japan, I think that's a really good thing. It's taken decades. Australia's had a very good economic relationship since the late 50s with Japan. It's taken decades, I think, to gradually build up political and military trust to the point where we can sign the agreement we had recently, signed last week. And I think it's good for Japan, it's good for Australia. You know, Japan is the most, people forget about this, Japan is the most important country in Asia outside of China. Japan is the most important US military ally, I think, in the world. There are more US troops in Japan than in any other country in the world. If Japan goes, basically, it's a much longer story than that's the end of Pax Americana. So Australia working with Japan, I think, is a very good thing.
Yeah, I would just say one thing about Australia, which is we're a democracy or something like it. robust public debate is important, and it's going to happen at different levels. But when it comes to the discussion about China, and I know this, Australia doesn't need lectures from the New York Times reporters about how to discuss China, but the level of discussion, the level of public discussion could do with improvement. And it does worry me when I see people given labels because they take a particular position on the issue. And when it becomes vindictive and personalised, I just think that just lowers the level of discussion that we need about this incredibly complicated issue. I do see in discussions in Australia, discussions with friends about China as well, it's very difficult to both register all of the momentous changes happening in China and the fact that the system has become more authoritarian, that we've seen mass detentions in Western Xinjiang region, and for example, to register all that, to absorb all of that, but also to arrive at a sort of a rational discussion about how Australia should deal with China, it's incredibly difficult. But it's not helped when the discussion becomes riven with personalised backbiting about it, which I find alarming.
I forgot to mention that. I should have said. I mean, I think our policy settings are right, but the execution has been very poor, diplomatically, on issue after issue. The Japanese approach is the best one: do more, say less. But that's not our nature.
But that's got to do with domestic politics in Australia, does it not?
Well, I guess it does. I mean,
It's not to excuse it, but they're playing to the crowd.
Well, there's also a real issue there. It's hard to sort of just say they're playing to the crowd because China is a genuine issue. I think Australia was early in recognising that and took some very tough decisions, like the Huawei, an absolutely correct decision, and the like, and we've taken a hit for that. So in some ways we're ahead of the world, but I just think there's too much freelancing, by ministers all the time, having a free kick at China as though it's cost-free, and it's not. Now we'll see whether it'd be very interesting to see whether it becomes an issue in the federal election. I think the government would like to make it one, but I think they've got to tread very carefully because it could backfire.
Is Hong Kong as lost to democracy as it seems at the moment?
Certainly for the time being, it looks like the central Chinese government is going to be remorseless about extinguishing any sources of potential opposition in Hong Kong. I remember during and after the 2019 protests against the government, and leading up to the introduction of the national security law in Hong Kong, for Hong Kong in 2020, I remember a lot of Hong Kong people were saying, you don't have to worry about this. It's just a law that's going to apply to a few troublemakers. And you even heard that after the law was passed in 2020. But what we've seen is that the central Chinese authorities and their proxies in Hong Kong have used that law to fundamentally rewrite the rules of Hong Kong politics. And it put a lot of people in jail who didn't expect to be there. Closed down newspapers, to close down publishers, put a real chill on the territory that I don't think is going to go away soon. That said, and Richard can speak much more to this than me, the rush of finance and money and banking out of Hong Kong that some people warned would happen, if that was going to happen, hasn't happened. And through different means, the central Chinese government has been propping up Hong Kong so it remains a strong financial centre. Now, whether it can stay that way is, I think, a question that you'd speak more to, Richard.
Yeah, well,
in that sense, it's been...
Okay, the Chinese have always calculated they can crack down on Hong Kong politically and have it prosper financially. There's two holdouts in Hong Kong. One is the judiciary, which they haven't got yet, and the other one is the Catholic Church. The Church in general, particularly the Catholic Church, which the Chinese are having a go at now, but that's a much harder nut to crack.
There's a lot of people leaving Hong Kong, 80,000, 90,000 people a month. there's a drain of expertise and personal money. You said most of the money's staying there, but do you think China anticipated this? Do you think it's of any concern? And what about Hong Kong as a central point for a lot of inflow of capital into China?
Yeah, I think it's definitely still important. As you know, China is one of the big reforms China's done in recent years. They've opened their domestic capital markets. Hong Kong is still the entry point for all that money. A lot of the US is effectively forcing, and China as well, Chinese companies listed in New York to delist. They're not going to go to Singapore. The Chinese government simply wouldn't allow that. If Singapore tried to get too many companies, the Chinese government would just tell them to stop. So they will come to Hong Kong. So there's going to be a lot of money for IPOs in Hong Kong. So I think Hong Kong still actually has an important role to play in the Chinese economy and also in the sort of what they call the Greater Bay Area. Yeah.
I'd simply add that the other element there is COVID as well. Now, one reason why quite a number of expats and also local Hong Kong people have been leaving is because of, Hong Kong has been yoked into mainland China's extremely restrictive travel policies to try to keep out COVID and now Omicron as well. And whereas Hong Kong itself may have preferred to keep more open, that's just not happening. And so a lot of people are leaving for that reason as well. So as long as this COVID pandemic continues to close China off, it's going to force people to leave Hong Kong as well.
China's recently renamed an entire state and certain areas in India on the Far East border within their own kind of discourse. And that's a bit of a thinly veiled claim on some of the land there. Add into that all the border conflicts and incursions and the like. Do you believe that that's the next area after Taiwan?
I don't think it's similar to Taiwan, but it's certainly, they had the flag raising ceremony the other day. I only know the Indian name. I don't know what the Chinese name is. But I think that's one of the big changes in global geopolitics in the last 3-4 years. India, famously non-aligned throughout its history, has now really turned very hard against China because of the border conflict. The areas that both sides claim will never be solved, it's far too big, but they had managed to have a system where they could just talk about it and talk it to death and they didn't need to do anything else about it. That's all changed now, and you've got both militaries butting up against each other, and that's now why you see India getting much closer. They're already doing it, but much, much closer to the US and to Australia and Japan because they basically lost faith in China as a good neighbour.
Jumping to my question, I'd love to get the both guests' view on Red Roulette by Desmond Shum. Ray recommended it to me the other day. He said, Jane said it's the best book you've read in the last few weeks about understanding China. I'd love to hear these two guys' view on Red Roulette.
Well, Richard interviewed the author, so you first.
Yeah. No, I think it's a great book. I think, it's very hard to get books about. It's a bit gossipy, but, from the inside of the system and how it works. And so I would highly recommend it. In fact, when Ray's harassing all of us, Peter, asked me to send him some recommendations, I sent him that recommendation.
Bit gossipy is never a negative in a book, is it, Richard? So that's one thing. I would say on the drive up here, Richard and I were chatting, and one of the things we were talking about is just how crucial those years in China that are described in that book are to understanding China now.
Remind us the years.
So those years are sort of it's the decade leading up to when Xi Jinping comes to power in 2012. And in particular, the 4 or 5 years before then, when China's become increasingly rich and officialdom is becoming increasingly corrupt as well. And what you do get in that book is a very strong sense of what it was like in those years, especially for people who could sort of get a glimpse of the inner chambers of power and how they operated. And to understand why Xi Jinping cracked down on corruption after 2012, why he started taking down these powerful families, that's very important to understand why China is moving in the direction it is now. And so that's one reason to read this this gossip-filled book, apart from all of the great
about
gossip.
the rich people of China and how they spend their money both in China and outside. What's the veracity? Richard, how much of it is true? 80%, 60%?
You know, I think in terms of the atmospherics and the like, it's pretty much all true. In terms of the deals that are described, it's much harder for me to tell, but it's very real.
Chris?
I always have this principle that you can't believe all of the gossip and rumours in the book, but you have to assume that something like that must have happened. Some version of it. I tend to think that's probably true. It's one of those books, some people have compared it, there's this book by Chairman Mao's former doctor as well, which is filled with errors and things that didn't happen, but it gives you a feel for what it was like inside as well. So sometimes you ignore the details and just take in what the general atmospherics that the book conveys.
I think the old saying in China is that all rumours are true.
Please.
Just some follow-up to some answers Richard gave on, firstly, the answer he gave about the Hong Kong judiciary not being got at, but we have an example of our own Justice Spiegelman essentially resigning from the court there, of the final appeal, because of his difference of opinion with the chief executive's view on the separation of power. So I think the court in Hong Kong is being influenced, and oftentimes it's more by people leaving or people's actions of getting out of the way. And similarly with the Belt and Road, with nations like Solomon Islands, where a change to recognising China over Taiwan has led to some unrest in that country. I'm just interested to hear why you think Belt and Road isn't as insidious as it is made out to be.
Yeah, well, look, I don't want to consecrate... Well, first on the judiciary. Jim Spiegelman is on the Lowy board, actually. I don't think he actually said, maybe I'm wrong, why he stepped down.
No, he didn't.
Yeah,
no.
Yeah. So I don't think...
That's the point. It's what's unsaid.
Well, look, you may be right, but I think I asked him, and he didn't tell me, actually. I mean, he's obviously protesting against something, but I just don't know what it, I don't know what the specific thing was. Obviously, the judiciary's under pressure. Under the national security law in Hong Kong, they get to choose the judges, so it's already perverted in some respects. But the top of the judiciary, which includes a number of Aussie judges still, like Mr. Spiegelman resigned, but I think Robert French is still there, correct? So I just don't think the judiciary has been got at or compromised entirely. On Belt and Road, I'm not here to consecrate Belt and Road, but it is wrong, I think, just to lump it all into as one thing, colonisation, whatever. And the case of Solomon Islands, that's really nothing to do with Belt and Road. It's about Taiwan-China competition. And the Chinese have certainly been giving out money there, particularly to the Prime Minister. But remember, the Taiwanese, when they were there, they gave out money as well, but it was done differently. They gave out money, it's called constituency payments. They gave it to individual MPs. China was more corrupt because they gave it all to the Prime Minister, who then gave it out himself and thus elevated his influence. So that's the eternal Taiwan-China struggle there. And it's also, of course, there's been attacks on ethnic Chinese businesses in the Solomons long before, and other Pacific nations, long before anybody heard of Belt and Road or the Taiwan-China struggle. So I'm not here to defend Belt and Road. I just think that the way people talk about it is often a little bit inaccurate.
I'd just add one point on that, just one general observation about understanding Chinese politics and policy making and the Belt and Road. We often read reports about how China has a plan for this and a plan for that, and by God, they do have a lot of plans. But often what these plans are really are templates for political campaigns in which the central leadership announces a broad goal to mobilise the government, to mobilise business, to mobilise provinces, to mobilise foreign supporters to support those broad goals. And so what you get, instead of the regimented plan that sometimes people imagine, is a much more patchwork, much more differentiated set of policies. And that doesn't mean it doesn't make a difference, but that difference can be much more distinctive in one country than another when it comes to Belt and Road, for example. And I think where certain strategic and economic interests align for China in a country, Belt and Road can mean a lot more. In other countries, it can be simply, propaganda dressing for something that may not be as impactful. So I think it's simply having that understanding about how Chinese policy making the work that helps as well. You can't just take one example and say, that's how the entire system works.
Plus, there's a big backlash in China against Belt and Road, and many of the finance officials have been really happy with the foreign criticism because it's helped them wind it back, because there were too many provincial state companies going overseas and making bad deals, wasting money, corrupting people. So you'll never get rid of the term because it's in the Constitution and it's Xi Jinping's personal policy, but it's different in many different places and in terms of actual cash being wound back.
I think there's one last question.
The Darwin port controlled by the lease by the Chinese, is that a problem to Australia? And recent comment by the Defence Department, if you've got anything to add to that.
That was a fascinating story in The Australian recently about how the Defence Department gave advice to the government that it did not compromise Australian security. Now, you might get lots of debate about whether the Defence Department was embarrassed by its advice some years ago and doesn't want to backtrack from that now. Certainly, I think it wasn't the advice that their minister wanted. I don't know what the government... I suspect there's a split in the government about whether to cancel it or not. As to whether it compromises Australian security, I mean, you sure as hell would never see it happening today. That would never get approved today. And I think there was another story in The Australian which I think I've discussed with people some months ago, which is maybe closer to the money, is find an Australian buyer. Because this Chinese company which has the lease is not... They're a property company, they're struggling, they're not very rich. I'm sure they would love to sell it, and that would be a much more elegant solution than having some sort of investment issue by killing the leash.
And Richard, if I could ask, what do the Americans have to say about it? I mean, they're planning to put more Marines into Australia, they're planning to put more Navy ports, they're planning to make Australia basically a big landmass, a big aircraft carrier with tons of American equipment. What do they say about it?
Well, they were against it before, but I don't feel it's the Americans and the Japanese and others really forcing Australia to do anything here. I think the initiative has come from within the government. I mean, I think the Americans would probably like it cancelled, but I don't think they seem to be running the issue.
You have a follow-up?
Is this something that we should get Ray onto fundraising to buy them out?
Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap it up. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I think Richard and Chris will be around for a little bit if you want to ask, but I think it's a beautiful night outside and we'll all disperse. Thank you very much. Bookachino is Avalon's premier bookstore at 66 Old Barrenjoey Road, Avalon, Sydney. Find us online at bookachino.com.au.